Welcome back to Mom in Mind. I'm your host, Dr. Kat. In our episode today, we are looking in a little more closely to the topic of surrogacy, or also known as gestational surrogacy. We are hearing the personal story from Lizzie Smith, who is a 40-year-old mom of James, who is 17 months old. She works as a school administrator, and her husband went through nearly a decade of infertility before their miracle baby boy was born. Lizzie is sharing with us what surrogacy is and what some of the reasons might be that people end up needing a gestational carrier. She also talks about some of the common misconceptions about surrogacy, including judgments from people like hurtful, unhelpful, or naive comments, what it's like to have to explain surrogacy, and how difficult that is. So let's welcome Lizzie. Welcome, Lizzie. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I'm extremely grateful that you wanted to come on and share your story. And as we were just chatting a little bit before we got started, I know, and you know, like how valuable it is to hear other people share a similar story. One, so that you know that you're not alone, but also I think some of the things that you're going to be talking to us about is so that other people can know really what it's like, and ideally suspend their whatever it is, their judgment or their misconceptions or yeah, false ideas around what actually happens for people. Yeah, so to that end, wherever you feel comfortable, please do share your story with us.
Okay, thank you. So my husband and I, like most people, after being married for a while, we decided that we wanted to have children. And after trying for a little while, it wasn't happening. So we saw a doctor, got some tests done, the OB, and everything seemed normal. And so she told us to keep trying. She said, "Oh, I bet you'll come back to me in a couple months and you'll be pregnant." We'll never forget that, but
Mm-hmm.
that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so more months went by, and we got past the year mark, which is when most doctors will tell you if you're under 35. At the time, I was to set up an appointment with a reproductive endocrinologist. And so at the year mark, we set up an appointment with them and got some more testing done, and still things were coming back normal. There wasn't really an explanation as to why it wasn't happening for us. So we were talking about our options at that point. And then in my story, a kind of a side note, I ended up getting really sick with a kind of rare lung fungal situation. And
Wow.
so yeah, it was crazy. It's managed now, but it came up suddenly and out of nowhere, and it was very rare, and it took a while to diagnose and to treat. So it
Wow.
derailed our family building for another year.
Yeah.
Um, so
Mm-hmm.
I had to deal with that for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, we went back to the reproductive endocrinologist, and he suggested that we try IVF. I still didn't really have a diagnosis at that point. It was said that I probably had adenomyosis,
Mm-hmm.
which is sort of like endometriosis. It's a problem with the uterine lining. But it's fairly common in a lot of women who have that conceive and carry pregnancies. So it wasn't a very incredibly definitive thing. It was just the only thing they could really tell us.
Mm-hmm.
So we proceeded with IVF, and it was a very long process for us because of the adenomyosis as well. The doctor wanted to, once we actually got embryos, which
Mm-hmm.
took a few tries of egg retrievals and the medications and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for transfers, every time that's transferring an embryo into my uterus, and every time before we did that, he wanted us to do additional medication that put me in menopause.
Mm-hmm.
And for 3 months at a time, because that's supposed to help treat the adenomyosis.
Mm-hmm.
So we did that before our transfers, and we had 4 transfers, and all of them failed. None of them worked. Um, and in between that, there
So
was
if I
also,
if I can
yeah, go
just
ahead.
real quick,
Sure.
like what is that um I mean, going through that process multiple
Mhm.
times is a lot. Um,
It's a lot. Yeah.
and it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of like time, math,
Yes.
and planning and all that. So for those four transfers,
Mhm.
what's the time span?
The time span, I'm trying to remember, was probably over about 2 years
Hmm. Yeah.
for that.
So lots
Yeah.
of ups and downs, physically,
Lots of ups and downs.
emotionally,
Yeah.
mentally, like all of the things. Yeah.
All of those.
Hmm.
Some it varies for people doing IVF. Some people have transfers much more quickly,
Hmm.
depending on different factors. Like if you're doing, we froze our embryos and I had the induced menopause and all of that. And then since it wasn't working, a lot of times in between the transfers, I also would have hysteroscopies, which are where they put a camera in your uterus to and take biopsies and look around. And I had pelvic MRIs, and I just had a lot of
Hmm.
different things because
Hmm.
they were trying to give us the best chance possible.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, it was still just this sort of adenomyosis diagnosis.
Hmm.
So after our fourth failed transfer, I remember our doctor before that was kind of hinting at surrogacy if it didn't work. He wasn't very comfortable continuing with transfers, even though we had more embryos,
Hmm.
just because he felt like we had tried everything that should work and at that point. And so I kind of knew it was coming. But every time after a failed transfer, you go in and meet with your doctor and you talk about, what happened and what are we going to do moving forward. It's always a very emotional appointment. I
Yeah.
remember crying at most of them. And he was wonderful. And the nurse we had was so wonderful. I'm still in touch with her, and she was always
Oh,
there for us.
that's
So
amazing.
yeah, she was great. And so at that appointment after the last failed transfer, he said, I really think it's time that you explore the option of surrogacy. We've done everything we can here. I think you have good embryos, but I think that it's not working in your body. I never had implantation. I never got pregnant at all. And I was sort of a little bit mentally prepared for that because I kind of knew it was coming. And it was kind of ironic because that day at our clinic, while we were in the waiting room, there was this energy in there with this group. And it's very somber in a
Yeah.
fertility clinic waiting room. Like people don't
Yeah.
talk, they don't make eye contact. Like it's a hard process, and you're just kind of trying to figure it out. So but
Yeah.
there was a group and it was multiple people, and that's not usually the case. And they were very excited and they were wearing matching t-shirts for for a transfer that they were having. And I come to find out that it was a surrogate transfer that was going on that day. And so there happened to be a representative from that agency, the surrogacy agency there. And those two things, one, I kind of just felt like it was a sign. This
Mhm.
was what was supposed to happen, and it was such a positive thing to witness just in that
Mhm.
waiting room. Like it was like a team, and they were all excited and
Mhm.
hopeful, which is such a hard thing to be when you're going through years of this.
Right.
Um, and then since she happened to be there, we were able to just chat with her that day and kind of pick her brain on, okay, if we are going to do this, what is it like and what do we need to do?
Mhm.
So it was a lot in one day, but I remember leaving there feeling actually hopeful for the first time in
Wow.
many years, which is great. It was a
Yeah.
great feeling.
Yeah.
Not simple. I wouldn't say that I thought, okay, this is it and this is just going to work. Of course not. But it was a little like, light at the end of the tunnel that I could focus on. Um, so
Yeah.
from there, we decided that we were going to pursue surrogacy. It's a long process. So it's a long process on top of a long process of infertility
Yeah.
already.
Right.
Um, but our fertility clinic was wonderful. They gave us a lot of guidance to start with. They said basically you're going to want to work with an agency. So agencies are people who coordinate the relationship between the surrogate and the intended parents. That's what they
Mhm.
call us, the
Mhm.
IPs. And so they kind of, have the surrogate supply, and they match you with somebody, and then they handle a lot of the logistics as well, because there's a lot that goes along with it. So our clinic said to start with, here's some agencies we've worked with. Why don't you talk to them and get an idea of, how they do their process, and if they have any available candidates. And so where we live, I'm in California, which is an extremely surrogate-friendly state, surrogacy-friendly state. So that was in our favor. We were able to meet locally with agencies and talk to them in person. And we kind of found out that they all sort of do the same process. It's very, very regulated. And so, legally and logistically and professionally and all of that, they were all very similar in their approach. So for us, what it came down to is if anyone would end up having an available surrogate match for us. And so I think we started the process in December of 2019 is when we started meeting with agencies. And in May of 2020, one of the agencies reached out with a profile for us of a potential match. So when we met with the agencies, you fill out a lot of paperwork to begin with, to make your profile as an intended parent. And so they have that, and it asks all kinds of questions from, fun things like, what are your hobbies, and, what do you are passionate about, things like that, to harder questions like, in a pregnancy, if this medical situation came up, what would your decision be? And then the surrogate fills out a similar questionnaire, and so that they can match you together as best they can, especially with things like, important medical decisions, like whether or not you'd be on the same page with termination for medical reasons, or, having an amnio, or, things like that come up with pregnancy. And so in May, one of the agencies sent us a potential candidate and said, we think this person might be a good match for you. I should say before that, we had been sent a couple profiles, and it's such a kind of odd thing looking through a profile of another woman, thinking, how do I choose like who is a good match for us and a good person? Because these are all wonderful, generous people who want to do this. And also the agencies, accept them first and make sure they're, in the right mindset and all of that to do it. So whoever they sent, my husband and I would think, they seem like a great person, but how do I know that this is the person? It's really hard to decide. And so we looked through a couple before we got sent our surrogate profile in May. And it was kind of one of those things where we thought maybe, but I don't know. And then we just kind of would leave it. And then when we got her profile, I read through it, and I couldn't wait to talk to my husband about it, because I just knew, I just thought this is our person. And I let him read it, and I stayed quiet, and he said, I think this is the one. And I said, me too. And we were excited about it. And how I knew, it's kind of hard to tell, but I think it's just a lot of the answers she had to questions on there really resonated with me. Things like being very empathetic toward our situation and infertility, and knowing that this is something that was out of our control, and we were doing everything that we could to become parents, and understanding how hard that was for us. And her just kind of answering in a way which is that I'm just here because I want to make that dream of becoming a parent true for someone, and I can do that.
That's awesome.
It's
Right.
awesome.
And I mean, so you're reading through profiles, not like you just like, sort of swipe right or whatever, and you meet this person, but in a way you are going to have a relationship with them. So there's so many things you're wanting to be aligned in as many ways as possible, because it's not just a
Absolutely.
transaction. It's not
No,
just here's this, you do that, we'll see you in 9 months or whatever. Um,
absolutely not. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are different stories of surrogacy out there, of course, in different situations. I would say it is, in where we are, and it's uncommon to have a transactional relationship with a surrogate. And for my husband and I, that was very important. One of our requirements was that she be in the same city as us.
mhm.
A lot of people, that doesn't, necessarily happen because of other factors have to match up too. But we thought we could make it happen, and if we were patient, and it did, luckily, because we wanted to be there
Mhm.
for everything. We wanted to see her. We wanted to go to all the
Yeah.
appointments. We wanted to be a team and not just have this long distance kind of relationship if we were able to. And luckily we were.
Mhm.
So, yeah. So, after reviewing her profile, we told the agency that, we really liked her and we wanted to move forward. And they came back to us and said she felt the same way about us. And so usually if you're in the same city, you would meet up in person with the coordinator from the agency, just to kind of, get an in-person, feel for each other. This was during COVID. So we also did this during COVID, which is
Mhm. Mhm.
another added layer of interestingness. But
Yeah.
so we did actually met her and her husband on a Zoom call. But it went really well. And on both sides, we agreed that we wanted to move forward. So from there begins a lot of logistical things that need to happen. So her medical records get sent to our clinic. They pre-approve her, and then she has to go in and get tests done at the fertility clinic, like blood work, and even a hysteroscopy to make sure that everything looks okay. So she did all of that and was medically cleared, which was
Mhm.
great. Sometimes I've talked to other intended parents who match with a wonderful person and then they don't get medically cleared, and it's just
Mhm.
crushing because then you have to stop, in
Right.
the
Right.
process. Um, so
There's
that
so
happened.
many, like, so many points along this journey where you could get like hopes up and then potentially be disappointed, and just like the ups and downs of this
Oh my
are
gosh, yeah.
seemingly constant.
Constant. I mean, I would say one thing that it doesn't make it easy, but that sort of prepared me in a way for that was going through infertility for so long.
Mm.
Because I mean, I was used to ups and downs of like things not working out, of just,
Mhm.
you never know, what's going to
Mhm.
happen. And you kind of just, I wouldn't say it makes it okay by any means, but you sort of like, it's not a shock to the system as
Right.
much when
Right.
you've been doing that for a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, so from there, the process is a lot of legal work as well. Once she's medically cleared, then contracts are signed. And there's usually a contract between the intended parents and the agency, and
Mhm.
then a contract between the intended parents and the surrogate. Um, and once all of that is signed, then you can kind of move forward with the embryo transfer part. So we had our transfer November 30th of 2020. Um,
That's
and
like deep in the
in the
really
pandemic, yeah,
deep in there. It was a tough
yep,
time. Yeah.
it was a tough time. Our fertility clinic was really wonderful. I hadn't met our surrogate in person. My husband and I hadn't during this whole time, up to then, because we couldn't because of COVID.
Mhm.
And they, at our clinic, they said, even though they were not allowing even spouses and things to come for embryo transfers and procedures there, in a surrogate case, they allowed me to come for the transfer because
Mm.
it's just, they knew how important that was in the
Yeah.
situation. So that was really nerve wracking. The first
Yeah.
time I met her was at our embryo transfer.
Wow.
Yeah,
Wow.
so it was a
Yeah.
lot of emotions, a lot of nerves.
Mhm. Mhm.
Pretty sure I was feeling like I was going to throw up when I was driving there.
Yeah.
Um, but she was so sweet and bubbly and wonderful, and we just started chatting, and it,
Mm.
it was great. So, and also it's a very intimate situation to meet someone you hadn't met before. So like with an embryo transfer, you're in this procedure room and they do it with a catheter. And, she's vulnerable very much
Mhm.
so in
Mhm.
that situation, but she was wonderful about it. So,
That's
yeah,
great.
it went really well. And then you go home and you hope, just like you do
Mhm.
with regular transfers. But yeah, I remember when we found out too. At that point, I had told the clinic not to call me anymore with results from embryo transfers because I couldn't handle it. I just
Mhm.
getting the bad news.
Mhm.
So I told them to call my husband because I couldn't do it. And
Great.
so they called him, and he picked me up. I was at work, and for some reason he picked me up that day, and we got in the car, and he turned to me and he said, "She's very pregnant." And I just started bawling because I
Yes.
had never heard those words before, for myself, or and it had been such a long time coming.
Mhm. Mhm.
And yeah, we had a wonderful experience moving forward with her. She was great. We texted pretty much every day.
Mm.
We had great communication. And then because it was during COVID, we still couldn't go to appointments at the
Mhm.
beginning.
Mhm. Mhm.
But about halfway through the pregnancy, they allowed me to come, not my husband as well, but so I got to go to ultrasounds and appointments and things like that. Um, we did have one at about 12 weeks. She had a hematoma, which causes bleeding, and it was pretty scary
Mm.
for a couple of weeks there. And I do remember she went into the emergency room, and my husband and I just had to sit on the couch at home and wait for text updates to see if our baby was still alive. And that was so difficult. If it hadn't been for COVID, I
Yeah.
would have been in the emergency room with her,
For sure.
next to
Yeah.
her, supporting her
Yeah.
and being there for my child. Um, but and then when it came to the birth, luckily by the time the birth happened, COVID had calmed down a little bit because
Mm.
we had some time where we weren't sure if we were going to be able to be there,
Right.
which
Yeah.
would have been devastating. I mean, I can't imagine not being there for his birth.
Right.
So by the time it happened, both of us got to be there. I watched my son being born. It was amazing. And we held him right after. We did skin to skin. Luckily, the hospital that we delivered at, they were absolutely wonderful. The OB was wonderful. They were used to doing surrogate births. They had
Mm.
done many of them.
Great.
So that was a fear of mine when we left the fertility clinic and went to a regular OB and with the birth, that people wouldn't know what to do with us,
Right.
and that I would be treated differently. But it really wasn't the case. And I mean, I think it also depends on where you are and how used to this process the medical professionals are.
Right.
Um, so for us, it was great. And I had a moment like right before my son was born, and the OB said, "Hey, mom, put your hands out right here. Put your hands out so you can get ready to hold the baby." And
Mhm.
I just stood there, and I looked around because I still hadn't processed that I was the mom.
Yeah.
Um, and during even the surrogate process, a lot of times people, not necessarily the OB, but other people would call her mom, "Oh, you're
Mm.
the mom," things like that. And she said, "Mom, put your hands here again." And I looked at our surrogate just out of, like used to reaction.
Right.
And the nurse came over and took my hands and said, that's you. You're the mom. Here comes your
Oh.
son. And it was such a beautiful moment. And I
Oh
am
my gosh.
grateful for them for being like that and just making it such, about me and her and all of us and just the beautiful process that it is. So,
Wow.
um, yeah, so he was
Um.
born and it went well. And then after that, we did get breast milk from her for about 3 months.
Mm.
And since she was local, we met up like once a week, excuse me. She would freeze it. And yeah, so, and we're still talking today. So,
That's
yeah,
amazing. That's
yeah,
amazing. Yeah, I mean, for how difficult a journey you'd had up until that point, it sounds like
right.
this was like easier than you could have anticipated. Not
It was.
easy in the sense of like not yeah, not complex, but just of all of the things that you had gone through and all of the disappointments and everything. Like, thankfully, you had this, aside from the hematoma, sounds like relatively,
Yeah.
and the pandemic, I guess,
Yeah. Yeah.
a
Right.
relatively easy process, meaning in terms of her health and baby's health. And
Absolutely. And just how lucky we got that we got matched with her. I still feel
mhm,
just so grateful. She's just a wonderful, wonderful human. So
that's
that,
amazing.
yeah, absolutely.
I'm so glad that that your son is healthy and everything went well. And during you were kind of mentioning a little bit or alluding to that there might have been some other types of challenges throughout the process. I mean, health-wise, everything was pretty much okay, but
Mhm.
um, the complex nature of other people's comments, like people calling her mom and things
Mhm.
like that. Can you kind of go back through, not line by line, but
Sure.
certainly like
Yeah.
what were the things that were challenging emotionally?
So, I mean, surrogacy is not that common of a process. People tend to not be as familiar with it. I think infertility is becoming more a part of the conversation of, family building. And I'm really happy about that. It still has a long way to go. And then you add the added layer of like surrogacy. And I know I have friends that or have met people who have had, donor embryos or donor eggs or donor sperm, and same thing. It's another added like
Mm-hmm.
layer of complexity that can be hard for people to understand sometimes. Um, and so, yeah, comments like I would have people who knew what we were going through say to me, well, how's mom doing? How's the mom doing? And, I would be like, do you mean our surrogate? I'm not going to share her name here. And they'd be like, well, yeah. And I'm like, because, I'm the mom too.
Mm-hmm.
But, I think part of that is people are very interested, at least from my point of view, it feels like people are very interested in pregnancy
Mm.
and the process of it and
Yep.
everything that goes with it. And women, that's a shared experience that they bond over a lot of times. And so most of the time the questions came from women about, how's the mom doing? And they wanted to know things like, is she craving anything? How is she feeling?
Mm.
The physical part of it. And I understand the curiosity there and I do get it, but that was hard for me sometimes because obviously I couldn't be pregnant and that wasn't my choice
Right.
at all.
Right.
And so it was a little bit hard. I tried to be honest with them. And then if I was on it on the spot to say, but, my husband and I, we're feeling so excited, but also anxious. And we're, trying to figure out what we need to prep for baby and,
Mm.
turn it back on that to be
Yeah.
like, oh yeah, we're the parents. So we have, these feelings too. But yeah,
Um, right. So that's with people who know what's going on.
right.
Um, and I mean, obviously that I think what you're describing is because there's some unfamiliarity with it.
Sure.
People don't really know the questions to ask or don't know the right
Right.
questions to ask or are kind of glossing over that this is uh you would have rather given the option, you would have rather been the person who was
100%.
pregnant and having
Yeah,
all the cravings or whatever it is.
exactly.
It's like another
Yeah,
layer of almost like, of course, you're excited to be having the process going on, but it's kind of in your, in a way, almost you having to also on the spot grieve a little bit, if I can use that word.
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's so infertility is can be very demoralizing,
Mhm.
at times. And it's heartbreaking. But I think especially as women, I think we put so much pressure on ourselves that, being a mom is the greatest thing. And, it's a natural thing and for women to be pregnant and that makes them so strong and wonderful and all of that. And it does. But when you can't do that yourself, you get some really, negative feelings about your body and yourself and what it can and can't do. And I remember feeling broken a lot of the times and thinking, my body doesn't work and it's not good like other women's bodies and, the layers of all of that. But I do think for me, at least by the time we got to surrogacy, my body had been through so much. I couldn't imagine putting it through more.
Right. Right.
I mean, obviously, if I had gotten pregnant, I would have been over the moon, and I still would have preferred that. But there was a tiny bit of relief for me that was going to stop, and the pressure too, because during infertility, it's you always think, well, maybe if I didn't eat this, or maybe if I didn't exercise like this, or maybe if I didn't stress so much, and that over and over again for years at a time really, really wears on your mental health. And so part of it was a little bit like, okay, I have tried everything I could with my body and I'm worrying all the time that I'm doing the right thing. And, it's a little bit of a relief to know that I did everything that I could, but I just, couldn't do it. So.
Right, which kind of also, in some ways, makes your well, in a lot of ways, makes your process just unseen by everyone.
Right.
I mean,
Absolutely.
there's, still the comments like I'm sure you experienced during your fertility process was similar as while the gestational carrier was pregnant is, people asking you questions like, well, when are you going to have kids? And all
Yeah.
these like really intrusive,
Mm-hmm.
things.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, it
yeah.
was
So
interesting.
how do you deal with that? Either explaining it or
Um,
trying to not explain it.
Yeah, I think for me it depended on the people and the situation, and also where my mental health was, like how
Mm,
much
mm-hmm.
energy I had to go into it.
Right.
But like for example, at my work, I had I think maybe one person there who I confided in who knew about it, but other than that, it's like I got to a point where I was like, well, I won't be back for a while because, we're having a baby. And I think they were like, what?
Uh-huh.
Because it's not that normal process of somebody being pregnant and that unfolding before people's eyes. And at that point, I thought about it beforehand because I knew I would have to give some kind of explanation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, depending on who it was, like in that situation, I had a brief, explanation of we are having a baby through a gestational carrier. He's going to be born, in 2 months, and we're really excited. And then if anyone had questions, I answered the questions.
Mm-hmm.
But it's funny that you mentioned that too, because actually, like a couple of weeks ago, I was a teacher, and I ran into a parent whose son was in my class, during that time. And I had my child with me, and she said, "Oh, you have a baby. He's a toddler now." But I said, "Yeah." She said, "I don't remember you being pregnant."
Mm.
And I said, "Yeah, well," and then she said, "Oh, my timeline must be off." And I said, and then I just left it at that because
Right.
I didn't, in that situation, I have no problem sharing it, but it was just one of those things where I was like, are we going to get into this right now? I mean, maybe not.
Right.
So,
Right.
but so it depends.
Yeah, sure. Right. And I'm sure sometimes you don't mind sharing it and sometimes you
Right.
don't want to get into the details and you just kind of
Right.
like want to go pick fruit at the grocery store or whatever,
Yeah,
like whatever thing
exactly.
it is that you're
Yeah,
trying to do.
right.
Um, you know,
For sure.
I mean, it's a lot of pressure to have to also explain something that you're
Yes.
going through that's so incredibly complex and
Personal.
emotional and personal, yeah,
Yeah.
and intimate,
Yeah.
meaning like close, um, to everybody.
It
Or,
is. And
it's,
yeah, it's an interesting thing as well, the feelings of, talking to other people who are intended parents or trying to become intended parents. And this feeling of having to prove yourself,
mhm,
that you're worthy to become a parent, is very present because, with people who have spontaneous pregnancies and things like that, it just kind of happens and people expect it, and whoever they are, it doesn't really matter. And then when you go through infertility, and then especially when you're approaching surrogacy, it's like you have to fight for, becoming a parent very hard. And then with the surrogacy process, it's like, please, pick me. I swear I will be a good parent. Like I deserve this, for whatever
Right.
reason. And then sometimes the outside pressure of, people thinking, is this something you really need to do? Surrogacy seems like a lot. And, but we just want to be parents like everybody else. It's just happening in a different way. So,
Um, I just have to ask this out loud. Did people say that to you directly? Like, is this something you really need to do? Or like,
no, no one
okay.
said that directly
Okay.
to
I was
me.
like, oh
No,
my
no,
gosh,
no.
tell me who they are.
Yeah, no, no, no. I would say, luckily,
Oh
like my
man.
family and friends,
Hmm.
they're all pretty informed, and that. But there's this underlying, feeling of that sometimes with the greater public and society kind
Oh,
of thing.
yeah. Hmm.
So that's all I meant by that. But yeah.
Oh, no, yeah. Well, I ask because sometimes people do say
Hmm.
things,
Hmm.
and
Sure.
there's just who knows why. They might just have
Sure.
no sense of
Hmm.
that might be a painful
Hmm.
thing to ask, or really
Right.
intrusive questions. People say things
Yeah.
like all the time, like asking you personal questions about either why you are going
Right.
through IVF, or even why you are using a gestational carrier. Like that's
Hmm.
it's incredibly personal stuff, and it
Hmm.
happens, or they ask.
Yeah. So something that's interesting is this goes along with, there are some misconceptions about surrogacy and gestational carriers. And,
Mhm.
one of those is it's a thing for people who don't want to be pregnant. That couldn't be farther from the truth. I mean, I'm sure that exists somewhere, but that's people, when they arrive at this option, have done everything else that they've wanted to do.
Right.
Um, so, I mean, I did actually hear with my own ears someone say one time, oh, this person, they use a surrogate. I just think she just didn't want to, like, be pregnant and like have to deal with that with her body. And I was with family members and one of my sisters, and I was so like proud and moved. We're close and she knows my story. Turned to this person and very, diplomatically said, have you ever considered that she might not be able to carry her own baby, and that's why this is happening? It's probably more likely something like that. It's probably really hard for her.
Nice.
And yeah, it was a great moment, and I was like, yeah, I didn't have to say it this time. So
That's
yeah.
right. That's
Yeah.
awesome. It's
Yeah.
so, I mean, it makes such a world of difference when you have people around you who are supportive and can
Yeah.
come through like that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And it sounds like in your family system, you did have support, and like how important is that part of this?
Oh, it's so incredibly important. I have connected, with people who are intended parents, mostly online, so I don't know them in person, because it's not like you walk down the street and just, meet people in that way a lot of times.
Hmm.
But and some of them don't have that support, and or aren't even wanting to tell anyone that this is what they're doing, because they know the reaction that they're going to get. And
Uh-huh.
it's already a little bit isolating, going through infertility and feeling different all the time and feeling like you have to explain yourself to everybody.
Mm.
And so not having that support, I imagine, would be incredibly difficult. I was really lucky. I was open with my parents. I mean, they knew everything about it. And the day we found out our gestational carrier was pregnant, we met up and we toasted with champagne, and they were there through all of it. So
Yeah, that is fantastic. I mean, to
yeah.
your point, as you were talking through just that act of being able to come together and celebrate together,
Yeah.
is a big deal.
Yeah.
If they know the journey you've been on,
Right.
to feel like you have a community of people there to support you, especially if like, the general public doesn't get it. You really need
Right.
that
And
kind
I
of
think
support.
and I think they mostly don't, but at the same time, it's just something that's unfamiliar. And
Hmm.
so this is
Hmm.
why I want to talk about it, so that it, becomes a part of conversation, that this is a thing that happens sometimes, and people can understand more about it and why people do it and how it
Mm-hmm.
feels and all those
Mm-hmm.
different things.
Yeah,
So
for people who are listening, who are just learning about this, um, like what do you what would you say in terms of what would you have wanted from people to hear from people who are just learning about your experience? Supportive things.
yeah, so I never mind when people have questions, genuine questions of like, oh, you're doing that. That's so interesting. Do you mind if I ask, like how you decided to do that, or what led you to this point, or because that's a normal and genuine and empathetic thing to want to understand more about other people. So I've never minded questions like that at all. Or I think what would really have felt really good would have been things like, congratulations,
Mm,
that's so great, you're going to be a parent, like that's amazing. And there's a quote that I like, that however parenthood comes to you is a miracle,
mm-hmm,
and that kind of attitude, people are curious, and that's fine to answer questions, but there wasn't always a lot of focus on. That's why I think I had that moment in the hospital of like, oh, me, I'm the parent, like there
mm-hmm,
wasn't as much focus on that.
mm-hmm,
um, and I've talked a lot about this with my husband, and I wonder a lot of times if that's how dads feel, some of the time, because they don't
mm-hmm,
go through the pregnancy, but they're
mm-hmm,
expecting their child.
mm-hmm,
And so they feel, like people recognize it and they feel bonded, but it's not the same as people seeing like a woman pregnant. They
mm-hmm,
don't have the same reaction. So it's
mm-hmm.
interesting in that way.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate you bringing both of those perspectives and just be supportive and congratulatory,
Hmm.
and also the partner's perspective.
Yeah.
Um, Both, like as you said, through a spontaneous pregnancy, but I mean, this probably has some additional layers for partner as well.
Yeah, I mean, my husband has been overwhelmingly supportive, throughout all of this, and I liked his focus. Like the positive focus for him was, I wasn't able to be pregnant, but he would say things like, "Well, we are equal partners now,
Mm,
in this, and we can do the same things, and it's not that you can do some things and I can't do them because of
mm,
pregnancy or birth or whatever."
mm,
And that was his way of being super positive about that, and I did appreciate that. It made it feel better in a way. So yeah.
right. Yeah, I mean, I know we've kind of um, gone through your story relatively quickly,
Yeah.
but all of the things that you've highlighted are so important. Both just sharing your personal story, but all of the ways that you wanted to come on and share this to help people understand this
Hmm.
a little bit more. And to your point, not a lot of people are either able or open to talk about it, and let alone on a platform where
Sure.
where you can
Yeah.
reach a lot of people. So, right, we've gone through your story in a short bit of time, and I know there's so much more to understand, but what would you like for people to understand for now and with your story?
So I guess basically that using a gestational carrier, it's a complicated process, both emotionally and logistically, but it is a in my experience, a wonderful, beautiful partnership. That's what it felt like for my family and her family. And it's just one way out of many that people expand their family. And it's a wonderful option for those who, have tried with IVF and other things on their own, and it just doesn't work. There are people, I think, who think that, a relationship between intended parents and a carrier might be a transactional situation. And though there are, legal parts to this, and things like that. In my experience, it is way beyond that, and it is so much more than that. And it is just, I wouldn't have my son if it weren't for our wonderful carrier. And every day I look at him, I'm grateful for her, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have him, because I wouldn't have had that.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing
Yeah.
with us. And yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time um, to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Thank you again, Lizzie, for coming on to share your story with us. For those of you who are listening who know someone that might need the support of hearing a story like Lizzie's, please do share this with them. As you know, one of the main goals of this podcast is to share enough information and education so that people know that they are not alone. Thank you so much for being with us. Until next time.